This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, March the 13th, 2024. Last week, we did a show with my friend, the Los Angeles Times book critic, Bethann Patrick, who was talking about a number of books on our disruptive age, books trying to make sense of all the disruptions. Fareed Zakaria has a new book out next week, The Age of Revolutions, which attempts to historicize what's happening in the world today in terms of all the disruptions. Michiko Kakutani has a book we discussed, The Great Wave, an era of radical disruption and the rise of the outsider. And then we had books on limitarianism by the Dutch critic Ingrid Robbins about a case against extreme wealth, and another book on unions. And then a book called Lessons for Survival by Emily Raboteau, or Raboteau as she's known in the Bronx. And this is what Bethann said about Emily Raboteau's new book, about why it's relevant in context of our age of disruption. In terms of our age of disruption is Emily Raboteau's Lessons for Survival, a book about what it's actually like, I think, to live in our age of disruption, in our revolutionary age. Tell me about this book. Is that a fair description?
I think that's a great description.
And of course, we have the great Emily Raboteau on the show today. The book's out this week. Emily, is Bethann Patrick right? Is your book an attempt to personalize our age of disruption, to make sense of it from perhaps the bottom up?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, Andrew. Yeah, I think Bethann's right. This book is an attempt to describe what it feels to live like now in an age of disruption. People are calling it an era of polycrisis. And that's how I would describe this too, particularly what it feels like to parent, in an age of disruption and polycrisis.
We've done shows on this term polycrisis. I think it's been developed by an economist at Columbia University, Adam Tooze. In your mind, what is the polycrisis? What does it mean?
What it feels like to me is living during an era of global awakening to an experience of the climate crisis, so what some people call the climate emergency, and even sometimes a climate catastrophe. Also coming off of and still being in the endemic period of a pandemic, global pandemic. Some of the other crisis issues that my book in particular is looking at are social issues having to do with Black life in the United States. Also looking at some of the decades of conflict that have led to the crisis in Israel, Gaza. Something that I've explored in the book in terms of thinking about the occupation of Palestine. Yeah, those are some of the hard things.
Emily, some people might be watching this and saying, of course, she's right. Things aren't good today. Lots of crises of one kind or another, economic, environmental, political, military. But that's not new in the world. It's always been the case. And in some ways, some people even argue that the world today in the 2020s is much more peaceful, much more civilized than any other time in history. How would you respond to that kind of argument?
I've been thinking about, as a parent, how to prepare my kids for the future. And there is a lot that I can draw on from the past, particularly coming from historically resilient people. I'm the child of a Black parent, an African-American man who gave me and my brothers what we call in our community the talk when I was a kid, around the age my kids are now, like 10, about racism, and to a degree, especially for my brothers who are darker skinned than me, how to protect themselves from state sanctioned violence. Uh, but we never got to talk about the climate crisis and how to prepare ourselves for that, because our parents weren't given that talk themselves, right? So, when my kids come to me and ask questions like, "Mom, what happened to winter?" It's hard to have a it's hard to know what to say. We don't necessarily have a script for that. So I would say to people like, yes, uh, especially those of us who come from historically resilient communities, know, uh, our people and many people have lived through existential crises before. And we need to draw on their lessons. And also, I think we're living in a moment where we're called to listen to the anxieties and fears of our children and to answer to them, and also to look to each other in terms of being a community about what kind of language we need to be using.
Yeah, the subtitle of your book is Mothering Against the Apocalypse. And that was something else that Beth Ann Patrick talked about. One of the other reasons she loved the new book, Lessons for Survival, is because of its focus on mothering. I'm going to run another short clip from my interview with Beth Ann last week.
Work is reported. Emily's work is as a journalist, and she's considering here her role as a mother. She's a mother of two sons. They're young, and she wants to talk about the circumstances that are happening right now, and also what might happen as her sons get older. And of course, as she does as well. And she is so smart in these essays about racism and climate change and late stage capitalism, and what it is engendering around the world.
Emily, Beth Ann talks about a lot of things, including mothering and late stage capitalism. She notes that your book is reported. It's a series of essays. It's not theory. It's not academic. It's very well written. It's already, as I said, getting excellent reviews. How do you report as a mother, and how do you report on, and I'm using this term from Beth Ann, maybe you're uncomfortable with it. How do you report on late stage capitalism?
I'm not uncomfortable with that term, and I would say how I'm reporting on it, and the other issues and themes of this book, uh, social and environmental justice issues in under late stage capitalism, have to do with, honestly, like paying attention to the signs that are around me. I live in the Bronx. I teach in Harlem. I'm scared for my kids' future. What I've noticed as like a person who walks around the streets, and these are things that have given me inspiration as a writer, like to really dig into what's going on in my community, are like a series of signs. um, so, for example, around the time my kids were really small, and there was a series of Black deaths going on that were, making the news, largely because social media was uh, showing these deaths, right? Um, was how to talk to our Black sons about police brutality. This was a talk that, as I mentioned before, I've been given by my own
Right. This is the quote unquote the talk that you got from your
the
father, and that
yeah, yeah.
you
It
give to your kids. How old are your kids, and are they all boys or girls?
They're boys. I have 2 Black sons. They're 11 and 12. And I just wanna say, like, there were signs in the neighborhood in the form of murals that were giving me kind of answers and guidance. They're called the Know Your Rights murals, and they appeared in neighborhoods in the city most plagued by police brutality. And I took pictures of those signs, and they gave me a feeling of kind of, I don't wanna say solace, but structure. Um, and then I started noticing other signs, like murals of birds that, as it turns out, are part of this big Audubon mural project. John James Audubon used to live in the neighborhood. Um, and those are birds that are expected to be extinct by the year 2080 because of climate change, but they're also appearing in neighborhoods where, frontline community where there's a lot of environmental uh, injustice, like poisoning infrastructure placed in neighborhoods that are making people have adverse health outcomes like asthma, which both of my sons have. Um, and then also signs about climate change. These are things put up by, public art projects about how climate change is affecting New York City. And these are like the signs literally around me that I began documenting as an amateur photographer and writing about. Um, so when I say polycrises, it's sort of something that's being commented upon. If one is paying attention to the signs. And then we have a lot of holes in the social safety net in terms of taking care of people in these times. And that's part of what this book is about too.
Emily, you say you're an amateur photographer. The book also features some of your photography. Is your writing an attempt to photograph, or is your photography an attempt to write? How does the photography and the writing fit together?
I think it's an impulse to document. It's like a documentary style. When I take pictures in the neighborhood of signs like these, it's because I know a lot of them are going to disappear. So it's also an active witness and memorialization. When you're talking about murals, they're going to get painted over, or someone else is going to do some other kind of graffiti, or, you know, business is going to change hands, or ownership of a building is going to change hands. And so this is like ephemeral kind of art and signage. And I really want to document it so that other people can see it before it's gone.
You're not the first person to write about birds and the polycrisis. We had Christian Cooper on, the Central Park birder, who of course was involved in a horrible scandal a few years ago. He has a new book out. How do birds fit into your narrative? Are they spectators to our quote unquote apocalypse, or are we spectators to their apocalypse?
I think it's mutual. I think it's mutual. But I think we have a lot to learn from them about adaptation and endangerment. And I'm glad you had Chris Cooper on. I
He
feel
was
like,
excellent. Yeah, delightful guy.
yeah. I want to meet him. I want to like talk about the murals and have him teach me more about those species. I think I have a lot to learn. We all have a lot to learn from him. But when he had that bad run-in in the Ramble in Central Park, it was on Memorial Day, spring 2020. It's the same day that George Floyd was murdered outside Minneapolis. And I think those two events got like twisted together in the cultural zeitgeist in a way that made it really evident for folks in a way that hadn't been before, that Black life is endangered because he's a birder, because Chris Cooper is a birder interested in conservation. Suddenly you had all these conservation places like Audubon, Sierra Club, uh, all of them putting out Black Lives Matter statements, as were so many institutions. And I think prior to that, conservation had been thought of in terms of wildlife, natural spaces, less so about endangered peoples. And I think we're really just beginning to tie those things together in the culture.
So the polycrisis is entangled. The issue you suggest of racism and of the environment. What about politics, Emily? It won't come as any news to our viewers that you're no great fan of Donald Trump. How does that all fit in?
I mean, I'm worried about fall 2024. Things were really hard under his reign. What did he say shortly after his election, or maybe it was right before? People in the inner city, I live in the inner city, are living in hell. What is his interpretation, right? I mean,
he's almost celebrating that, I think, isn't he? He
you're
wants to partition off hell so that he doesn't have to go there.
Yeah, who wants to go to hell? I mean, some of us live in that place, and
But it isn't hell, is it? I mean, and that's another
it's
piece of your book is you're giving, and not that the Bronx needs Emily Raboteau to give it dignity, but that's what you're doing partly in the book, isn't it?
yeah, this is a piece where people live and parent and play and pray. It's a place of deep humanity, and also cultural productivity and spirituality and joy and politics and local politics, right? I mean, it is the case that Black Americans are 75% more likely than other Americans to live in fence-lined communities sited near facilities that are producing hazardous waste. Whether that's highways, living encircled by highways like the Cross Bronx Expressway, or living near wastewater treatment plants, or living near one of these industrial farms where they're spraying pig shit and piss on your house. This is going to be bad for your health, and yet and yet we fight those things, and we plant gardens and we raise children. And I mean, I promise you, even in Gaza right now, the children are playing.
Do you feel that your experience in the Bronx with your family is in some ways similar to what's happening in Gaza?
I feel uncomfortable making that association when there's genocide and starvation happening.
We are speaking with Emily Raboteau, the author of an important new book, already very well received. Got a great review yesterday in the New York Times. Lessons for Survival, Mothering Against the Apocalypse. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Emily are brought to us with the help of Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics. Excellent new publication covering a lot of the material that Emily writes about. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, short video, and then we'll be back with Emily to talk about how we're supposed to fight, quote unquote, the apocalypse. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Emily Raboteau, the author of Lessons for Survival, Mothering Against the Apocalypse. We ran a show last week in which Bethann Patrick, the LA book critic, talked about Emily's new book. She talked about the way in which Emily argued against what Bethann called transactionalism. I want to show this clip and then come back to Emily and talk about transactionalism and her objection to that. So here's a short clip.
We don't know what the apocalypse is. So she puts that in quotation marks. She calls the book, the subtitle is Mothering Against the Apocalypse. And so it's the idea of radical caregiving that makes the most sense to her, that all of us need to think about this in terms of our own lives, whether we have children or not, but also in terms of the Earth's life, that we need to consider the idea of radical caregiving, the idea of giving care to something. Radical caregiving means that, first of all, you might give a great deal of yourself. And it also means that you're not looking for something in return.
We talked, Emily, earlier about Trump. Of course, he is the ultimate ideologist of transactionalism. He can never imagine doing anything without getting something in return. Is that, if there's a core argument in the book, is it against transactionalism? Is it against the idea that everything we do needs to be thought of as what we're going to get in return, particularly when, of course, it comes to the environment?
I think when you're operating from a place of radical care, thinking about environmentalism, but also thinking about radical care more generally in terms of kinship, um, not merely for one's nuclear family or beloved community, but rather for the web of life that we all belong to, including non-human kin. Uh, Transactionalism isn't even an operating principle because I think one does understand when one is practicing radical care, when one is thinking in terms of like a mothering kind of love, whether or not one is a one is a biological mother, one understands that you are receiving, right? That you have already received and you are receiving love in return.
It's thinking perhaps in economic terms that is the core of transactionalism. And of course, many environmentalists would argue that what we discussed earlier, late stage capitalism, that is the real problem when it comes to the environment. Would you agree? Is the problem with our imminent, or what some people see our imminent environmental catastrophe, this so-called apocalypse, is it capitalism itself?
Yeah, it's an economic system based on fossil fuel that puts profit above life, and not just human life. I had the opportunity to go to the Arctic, ground zero of climate collapse, and I was visiting a community of elders in a place called Alakanuk, which is a small village in the coastal Alaska, where the Yukon River empties out into the Bering Sea. And I was talking to elders in that community, like octogenarians who are old enough to remember the time before the warming began. And one man in particular that I talked to, his name was Dennis Sheldon. His real name is Kitu Rauria. I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it means the one who's passing by. And he had been taken into as a child, my children's age. He was 11. He was taken into one of these like state schools where they tried to beat the Indian out of him. These places where they take your language and they take your culture and they remove you from your community. Maybe they even kill you. He made his way back at age 19, having lost his language, and then acquired it again. And when I asked him, what do you do with your anger? What do you do with all this loss? They've lost even the ability to keep their fish and game cold and fresh under the ground as they used to when he was small, because the permafrost is melting and their very houses are shifting and falling into the river. What do you do with your anger? And his answer to me was, well, that's easy. We take care of each other. And he wasn't speaking from an economic framework. It wasn't thinking in terms of care transactionally.
And how does that translate into the 2020s in the Bronx or New York City or the United States of America?
I mean, speaking for myself, it's paying attention to like the helpers, like what Mr. Rogers said, in a time of crisis, when you're talking to small people and they're scared, his advice was, to tell them to look for the helpers. And there, I think you will find care almost anywhere. In my community right now, there are a lot of people working really hard to unbury a brook that was buried. And it'll be the first, what we call daylighting. That's the unburying water. It'll be the first daylighting story in New York City. And it's an act of climate mitigation, because we have, these rain events now. We have more water and our infrastructure isn't fit to handle it. Our sewers can't handle it. Our subways can't handle it. So they're going to unbury this brook as an act to try to redress some of the harm that was done. And that's an example of an act of care, like in action.
Emily, in 2026, America will be I'm not sure if this is the right word, celebrating its 250th anniversary of the creation of the Republic. How does Lessons for Survival, how does it fit into the narrative about America? How do you feel about being an American?
I'm a bicentennial baby. I was born in 1976, which means I'm Generation X. I've also been described as part of the generation that's like the last generation that can stop climate change. I don't think that's the right framework of description either. That it's something that can be stopped, right? It's something that we're living through and with and need to combat, certainly. But celebration of the Republic, I think we need to look for other things to celebrate.
Like what?
Hmm. Joy and perseverance, you know, in the face of a narrative that has persistently put profit above human life. Who are the people in this nation and globally who have fought that kind of who have combated that kind of force and narrative? What are the lessons we can learn from them? You know, in my childhood, the stories I was told were about the civil rights movement. That was my parents' generation.
There'll be a lot talked, there already is a lot talked in 2026 about something people call the American dream. Bethan, Pat.
There is a phrase or a catchphrase that works very well. You can have it all, but not at the same time. And Emily Raboteau is saying, look, maybe we can't have it all at all, period. Maybe we need to start thinking about the earth itself and about others and not think so much about how much we all can have.
Again, I'm riffing off what Bethan said, Emily, but do we need to wake up from this thing we call the American dream of being able to have everything we want all the time?
I'm so glad Beth Ann liked this book as much as she did. She has such smart things to say. Do we need to wake up from that dream? I think we are. I mean, aren't
Well,
we
you
ending up?
are, and some of your
Mm,
friends and readers, but I'm not sure most Americans are.
yeah, but hasn't the Surgeon General told us we're having a crisis of loneliness right now? Like, how happy are
He
we?
did, but that doesn't
How
seem to
happy?
discourage people from being on social media, which he blamed
Yeah.
for this crisis.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think deep down most of us know that we're happier when we're on a walk outside or in communion with others, whether that's like sharing a meal, uh, or being in a classroom than when we're just doom scrolling on our phones. You know, it's bad for our postures, it's bad for our brains, it's bad for our levels of stress, and the algorithms are just built to try to make us buy more things. And so, yeah, do we need to wake up from that? I think so. I think people are.
What's your dream for not so much America, which is a bit of an abstraction, but for your two boys? What's the dream in Lessons for Survival? Because it's, whilst the title sounds rather dire and bleak, mothering against the apocalypse, it's actually, in its own way, a cautiously optimistic book. Where's the dreaming in the book?
Yeah, I did put apocalypse in quotes because I didn't want to suggest the future is foreclosed. And I also didn't want to be offensive to activists, particularly youth activists who are working really hard to prevent worst case scenarios. Um, you know, like those kids in Minnesota, not Minnesota, Montana, who like sued the state and won, you know, like the right to a future. Um, all the work that's being done legally to try to give rights to rivers and trees, forests, to protect them. I find hope in those things. And also, I have a friend named Ayanna Mathis. She's a writer who also happens to be a seminary student at Union Theological Seminary here in New York City. And she reminded me that the root word, like when we're talking about apocalypse in ancient Greek, um, it means unveiling or uncovering. One thinks of, like, the scales being taken from our eyes, or waking up. um, when we think of apocalypse, we often think of the end times, the sort of eschatology that has to do with fire and brimstone and locusts and floods. But, what if it's an invitation to really see, you know, to think about escaping systems that entrap us? Yeah, for you asked about my kids. My hope for them is that they thrive, that they experience joy, and that they understand that they can fight systems that are put in place
You
to kill.
mentioned you were born in 1976, so you
Mhm.
missed the 60s for better or worse. Some people have suggested that the 20s are rather like the 60s, a paralyzed political system, a very unpopular war or support for foreign countries, and a youth which is challenging the establishment. Is there something that's happening in the 20s, do you think, the 2020s, that might bring about the kind of change that was created in the 1960s?
Man, I wish I was as prescient in terms of, like, seeing the future as Octavia Butler was. She wrote The Parable of Sower, I think, in the 80s, and it took place in 2024, and it was a description almost exactly of what we're living through now. But you're asking me to sort of look forward and imagine back, in a sense, what this period uh, uh, is all about and what it's leading to. And I don't know, but I do know, yeah, young people are justifiably angry, and they're asking us quite literally for their lives.
Finally, Emily, it's a practical book. As Beth Ann said, it's a reported book. If there's people have been watching and listening saying, well, this is all very well, what can I do? What might be one or two things that people can practically do, reasonably do, and not transform their lives in terms of lessons for survival? As our responsibility, we did a show on how to be a good ancestor. I guess in a sense, your book could also have that title. How do we be good ancestors in the 2020s?
I think in the 2020s, it's about, yeah, getting off your phone and looking in one's local community to see what's already being done, because I promise you things are already underfoot, and connecting to those things in a way that aligns with one's own ability and talent, sensibility, and heart.